The ridge. The tank destroyer had been burning for hours, its blackened hull still radiating heat into the frozen air of the Vosges Mountains. Audie Murphy crouched behind what remained of the M36's armored side, watching grey figures move through the pine trees 200 yards down the slope. January 1945 had turned eastern France into a landscape of ice and smoke, where American positions clung to ridgelines that command called defensible, and the men knew were death traps waiting to spring. The morning patrol had started routine enough, 12 men following a deer trail through snow-heavy forest to check German positions in the valley below. Intelligence said they'd find maybe a company of Volksgrenadiers, old men and boys, looking for a reason to surrender. Instead, Murphy's squad had walked into veterans pulled back from the Eastern Front, soldiers who fought like cornered wolves because they knew the war was ending but weren't ready to quit. Sergeant Collins had taken the first burst of machine gun fire before anyone saw muzzle flashes. Private Rodriguez caught shrapnel when mortars started falling like steel hail. Within minutes, Murphy found himself responsible for 2 green replacements who looked barely old enough to shave and a wounded man whose blood was already freezing in the snow. The tank destroyer had been their salvation and their trap, a burning monument to American overconfidence that now offered the only hard cover between his scattered squad and the Wehrmacht battalion working its way up the ridge. Murphy checked his ammunition again. 60 rounds for the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the destroyer's deck, maybe 40 rounds of rifle ammunition between the 4 survivors. Not much to hold high ground against a reinforced battalion, but the ridge commanded the entire approach to 3rd Infantry Division lines. If the Germans took this position, they could roll up the American flank and turn what should have been a local counterattack into a breakthrough that might cost hundreds of lives. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Rodriguez pressed himself against the tank destroyer's tracks, trying to stay conscious while his field dressing slowly turned red. The replacements, Baker and Chen, huddled behind whatever cover they could find, following Murphy's hand signals because their voices might carry to the enemy positions below. In the distance, German voices echoed through the forest, officers shouting orders in syllables that cut through the thin mountain air like axe blades. Logic said to fall back, to carry Rodriguez as far as they could before the next assault came. But Murphy had learned to distrust logic in places like this. The Vosges Mountains didn't care about tactical doctrine or the clean lines drawn on situation maps back at regiment. They cared about who was willing to stay when staying meant dying, and who could make every round count when there weren't enough rounds to waste. He looked down at Rodriguez, whose dark eyes held a mixture of pain and trust that made Murphy's chest tighten. The kid was maybe 19, from some small Texas town that probably had more churches than streetlights. 3 weeks in the squad, eager to prove himself worthy of the unit's reputation. Now he lay bleeding because Murphy had led them into an ambush that better intelligence might have prevented. The cold bit through Murphy's wool jacket as he adjusted his grip on the machine gun. Somewhere below, the Germans were regrouping for another push. He could feel it in the silence, not the empty quiet of abandoned ground, but the loaded stillness that came before men with rifles started moving uphill. Baker caught his eye and pointed toward movement in the tree line. Chen worked the bolt on his M1 rifle, the metallic sound carrying further than it should in the frozen air. Murphy thought about the letters in his jacket pocket, words from home that felt like they'd been written in another century. His mother asking about the weather, his sister mentioning a dance at the church social. Simple things that belonged to a world where young men didn't crouch behind burning vehicles, counting ammunition and waiting for the next wave of field grow uniforms to break from the forest. The ridge overlooked the Colmar pocket like a stone altar, its frozen slopes already littered with the debris of 3 failed German counterattacks. Now they were coming again. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments, how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The attack came without fanfare, just movement between the trees, then grey figures breaking into the open, with bayonets fixed and potato masher grenades in their fists. Murphy opened fire with the .50 caliber, feeling the weapon's brutal recoil slam through his body as tracers reached toward the advancing infantry. The machine gun's voice echoed across the Vosges mountains like thunder, drowning out everything except the sharp crack of Baker and Chen's rifles from their positions behind scattered rocks. Men fell in the snow, some screaming, others silent. But more kept coming. These weren't the demoralized conscripts that intelligence had promised. These were Wehrmacht veterans who knew how to use terrain, who advanced in bounds while their comrades provided covering fire from concealed positions. Murphy swept the machine gun in tight arcs, watching his ammunition counter drop with each burst. 60 rounds had seemed like enough when the morning started. Now it felt like counting heartbeats. Rodriguez struggled to his knees and added his carbine to the defensive fire, gritting his teeth against waves of pain that turned his face pale as winter fog. The kid was tough, tougher than he looked, but blood loss was blood loss, and Murphy could see him weakening with each shot. A potato masher grenade exploded close enough to shower the tank destroyer with dirt and metal fragments. Machine gun bullets sparked off the vehicle's armor, sending ricochets whining into the grey sky. From his position behind a fallen log, Baker shouted something about ammunition. The words were lost in the noise, but his meaning was clear from the way he held up his rifle. Chen's M1 had gone quiet too, either jammed or empty. Murphy burned through another 10 rounds of .50 caliber, cutting down a group of Germans who'd worked their way to within 50 yards of the ridge crest. The silence that followed felt temporary, loaded with the promise of more movement in the tree line. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio they'd managed to salvage from the destroyed M36. Static and distance turned his words into fragments, but Murphy caught enough to understand. No reinforcements available. Hold position at all costs. Help was coming, but it might be hours. The platoon's other squads were pinned down in their own sectors, trading rifle fire with German infiltrators who seemed to be everywhere at once. Murphy thought about the tactical situation with the part of his mind that stayed cold and analytical even when bullets were flying. The Germans had committed serious strength to this ridge, more than they should waste on a local action unless they saw something bigger. Maybe they were probing for weak spots in the 3rd Infantry Division line. Maybe this was the opening move of a larger counterattack designed to disrupt American preparations for the final push into Germany. It didn't matter. What mattered was the next 10 minutes, and the 10 minutes after that. Rodriguez was losing too much blood. Baker and Chen were down to their last clips. The .50 caliber ammunition wouldn't last another sustained engagement, but the ridge still commanded the valley approach, and American lives depended on keeping it out of German hands. A new sound drifted up from the forest, the clanking rumble of tracked vehicles moving through snow. Murphy felt his stomach tighten. Infantry he could handle, even outnumbered. But if the Germans brought armor up that slope, his position behind the burning tank destroyer would become a death trap with no way out. He tried to raise Morrison on the radio, but got only static. Either the lieutenant was too busy to answer, or the Germans had gotten to his position too. Chen appeared at Murphy's elbow, moving in a low crouch that kept him below the level of the tank destroyer's hull. The replacement was maybe 18, with eyes that had seen too much in the 3 weeks since he'd joined the unit. He held out a bandolier of .30-06 ammunition, rifle rounds, not machine gun, but Chen's expression suggested they might be the last rounds available. "How many more waves you think they'll send?" Chen asked, his voice barely audible over the wind that whistled through the destroyed vehicle's twisted metal. Murphy looked down the slope toward the tree line where fresh movement suggested the Germans were forming up for another assault. The tactical manual would say this position was untenable. Logic would say to fall back while they still could. But sometimes logic was a luxury that young men couldn't afford when other lives hung in the balance. "As many as it takes," Murphy said, checking the machine gun's feed mechanism, "but we'll make them pay for every yard." The rumble of German armor grew louder, echoing off the frozen slopes of the Vosges Mountains, until it seemed to come from every direction at once. Murphy pressed himself against the tank destroyer's hull and tried to identify the sound. Not the heavy growl of a tiger or panther, something lighter, maybe a Stuggy or one of the assault guns that Wehrmacht units used for infantry support. Still enough to turn his defensive position into scrap metal if it got within direct fire range. Rodriguez had gone quiet, slumped against the vehicle's tracks with his carbine across his knees. His breathing was shallow but steady, and his eyes still tracked movement in the tree line below. Tough kid from Texas, who'd probably never seen snow before the 3rd Infantry Division crossed into eastern France. Now he was bleeding in it, holding a rifle with hands that shook from cold and shock but hadn't let go. Baker crawled over from his position behind the scattered rocks, keeping low as stray bullets whined overhead. His face was streaked with cordite residue and pine needles, making him look older than his 19 years. "Sarge," he whispered, using the unofficial rank that the squad had given Murphy whether the army agreed or not. "Chen thinks he saw movement on our left flank. Looks like they're trying to work around behind us." Murphy nodded, unsurprised. It was good infantry tactics. Pin the Americans in place with frontal pressure while a flanking force moved through the forest to cut off their retreat. The Germans had probably been planning this maneuver since the first attack failed. Now they were executing it with the methodical precision that made Wehrmacht units so dangerous, even this late in the war, when their equipment was wearing out and their replacements were barely trained. The radio crackled again, Lieutenant Morrison's voice cutting through static that suggested he was transmitting from several miles away. "Tiger 6, to all Tiger elements. Heavy contact across the sector. No reserves available for immediate support. Maintain positions and wait for artillery support. Repeat, maintain positions." Murphy almost smiled at that. Artillery support in these mountains meant hoping the forward observers could see through the pine canopy and identify targets without dropping shells on friendly positions. It was better than nothing, but not by much. He'd learned to count on what he could see and touch. The machine gun, the ammunition that was left, the men around him who were still breathing. Chen appeared at the edge of the tank destroyer's shadow, his rifle held ready, but his movements careful to avoid silhouetting himself against the snow. "Contact left," he reported in the clipped phrases they'd learned to use under fire. "Squad strength, maybe more, moving through that draw about 200 meters out." The tactical situation was becoming clear, painted in the kind of stark choices that combat presented without ceremony. The Germans were setting up a classic double envelopment, pressure from the front, flanking movement from the left, probably another flanking force working around the right side of the ridge that they hadn't spotted yet. Standard doctrine said to fall back before the pincers closed, but standard doctrine didn't account for what happened to the men in the valley if this ridge fell into enemy hands. Murphy thought about the letters in his pocket again, words written by people who trusted him to come home. His mother's careful script asking about the cold weather, his sister's cheerful news about church socials and high school basketball games. Simple things that belonged to a world where young men didn't have to choose between their own survival and the lives of strangers they'd never meet. The sound of the German assault gun was getting closer, accompanied now by the crunch of boots in snow and the occasional clatter of equipment against tree branches. Voices carried through the forest, NCOs positioning their men for the next attack, officers coordinating the movement that would squeeze Murphy's position like a vice, professional soldiers doing their job with the same grim efficiency that he recognized in himself. Rodriguez stirred, lifting his carbine with an effort that made Murphy's chest tighten. "How much time we got?" the kid asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Murphy checked the machine gun's ammunition one more time, counting rounds he'd already counted twice. The German flanking movement would need maybe 10 minutes to get into position. The assault gun would take 5 minutes to reach effective range. Artillery support, if it came at all, was at least 20 minutes out. Simple mathematics of time and distance that added up to an equation with no good solutions. "Enough," he said, settling his hands on the machine gun's grips. In the tree line below, grey figures were forming up for what looked like a final assault. Not just squad strength this time, but the better part of a company. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The assault gun broke through the tree line like a steel predator, its low profile and angular armor designed for exactly this kind of infantry support role. Murphy could see the 75mm gun traversing toward his position, seeking the range that would turn the burning tank destroyer into an eruption of metal fragments. He had maybe 30 seconds before the German crew found their mark. 30 seconds to do something that every tactical manual would call suicide. The 50 caliber machine gun was still mounted on the tank destroyer's deck, its ammunition feed intact, despite the fire damage that had gutted the vehicle's engine compartment. Murphy climbed onto the burning hull, feeling heat through his boots, even as January wind cut through his jacket. The smell of diesel fuel and cordite filled his nostrils, mixing with the pine scent of the Vosges mountains and the iron smell of blood from Rodriguez's position below. From his elevated position, Murphy could see the entire German attack developing. Infantry moving in bounds through the forest, using cover with the skill of veterans who'd survived 3 years of war on multiple fronts. The flanking force on his left had almost reached positions where they could pour fire into his rear. More movement on the right suggested a third group was completing the encirclement, professional, methodical, overwhelming. He opened fire with the machine gun, sending tracers down the slope toward the assault gun and its supporting infantry. The weapon bucked against his shoulder, its recoil transmitted through the tank destroyer's damaged frame. 50 rounds left, 45, 40. He swept the gun across the advancing infantry, watching men drop or dive for cover, but knowing there were too many to stop with small arms fire. Baker and Chen fired from their positions, their M1 rifles adding their voices to the defense. Rodriguez managed to get his carbine into action, though Murphy could see the effort it cost him. 4 men against a reinforced company, fighting from a position that should have been abandoned an hour ago. The kind of tactical situation that ended badly in every training manual ever written. The assault gun's main armament swung toward the tank destroyer, its crew taking time to ensure a killing shot. Murphy kept the machine gun trained on the German infantry, knowing that every second he remained visible on the vehicle's deck was another second closer to death. 30 rounds, 25. The ammunition counter spun down like a clock, measuring the last minutes of his life. Then the strangest thing happened. Time seemed to slow, the way it sometimes did in moments when fear and determination balanced each other perfectly. Murphy found himself thinking about Rodriguez's hometown in Texas, about Baker's stories of his girlfriend back in Ohio, about Chen's quiet pride in his Chinese-American heritage that some people questioned, but that made him fight harder than anyone else in the squad. Men who'd followed him into this ambush and were now counting on him to get them out. He traversed the machine gun toward the assault gun, knowing the armor was too thick to penetrate, but hoping to suppress the crew long enough to matter. 20 rounds. 15. The German gun was almost in position, its long barrel seeking the exact angle that would end the defense of this ridge. Murphy held the trigger down and walked his fire across the assault gun's vision blocks, hoping to blind the gunner for a few crucial seconds. The machine gun went silent, with 8 rounds still showing on the counter, a malfunction that Murphy's hands cleared automatically while his mind registered the sound of the German gun traversing. Mechanical sounds that meant death was measuring itself in degrees and minutes of angle. He got the weapon back into action and burned through his remaining ammunition in one long burst that swept the slope clear of movement. In the sudden quiet that followed, Murphy became aware of several things at once. The assault gun's main armament was pointed directly at his position. German voices were shouting orders from positions that seemed impossibly close. His machine gun was empty, and there was no more ammunition for it. But something had changed in the rhythm of the attack, a hesitation that suggested the German commander was reconsidering his options. Rodriguez called up from below, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Sarge, look at the tree line!" Murphy followed the kid's gaze and saw what had stopped the German advance. Bodies in field growl uniforms scattered across the snow, testimony to what concentrated machine gun fire could accomplish when directed by someone who refused to miss. Not enough to break a company-strength attack, but enough to make the survivors think twice about pressing forward into that killing zone. The assault gun's crew was having second thoughts too. Murphy could see movement around the vehicle, infantry who should have been advancing, but were instead taking cover, waiting for someone else to test the American position first. The flanking forces had stopped moving, probably receiving new orders over field telephones or hand signals. In that moment of tactical pause, Murphy understood something that no training manual could have taught him. Sometimes courage wasn't about being fearless. Sometimes it was about being afraid but staying anyway, because the cost of leaving was worse than the cost of staying. The silence stretched across the frozen slopes of the Vosges Mountains like a held breath. Murphy remained motionless on the tank destroyer's deck, his empty machine gun still trained on the German positions below. From this elevated position, he could see the assault gun's crew conferring near their vehicle, probably trying to decide whether the American position was truly neutralized or just waiting for them to advance into another killing zone. What happened next would never appear in the after-action reports that Lieutenant Morrison filed with battalion headquarters. The official record would note determined resistance by a small American force and effective use of available firepower to repel enemy attack. Clean military language that turned 45 minutes of terror into a few sentences suitable for headquarters consumption. The truth was messier, more human, and infinitely more complicated. Murphy climbed down from the tank destroyer, his legs unsteady from adrenaline and the realization that he was still alive. Rodriguez was unconscious now, his breathing shallow but regular. Baker and Chen emerged from their positions, their faces carrying the stunned expression that came after surviving something that should have killed them. In the distance, American voices were calling, reinforcements finally arriving to secure a ridge that 4 men had held against impossible odds. "How'd we do it?" Chen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the question they were all thinking, but hadn't dared to voice while the shooting was still going on. Murphy looked down the slope at the scattered evidence of the German attack. Bodies in the snow, abandoned equipment, the assault gun backing toward the tree line as its crew decided that this particular ridge wasn't worth the cost of taking it. The tactical situation had shifted in their favor, but he couldn't explain exactly how or why. "They stopped believing they could take it," he said finally. It was the closest he could come to articulating something that defied military logic. The Germans had possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. By any reasonable calculation, they should have overrun the American position within minutes of their first serious assault. But war wasn't entirely about reasonable calculations. Sometimes it was about the moment when attackers realized they were paying too high a price for ground that might not be worth taking. Sometimes it was about 4 men who refused to acknowledge that their situation was hopeless and who fought with the desperate efficiency of people protecting something more valuable than their own lives. Baker was staring at the tank destroyer's hull, where bullet impacts had chipped the paint and left bright scratches in the steel. "You were up there for 10 minutes, he said to Murphy. 10 minutes on a burning tank with a whole company shooting at you. That ain't normal." It wasn't normal. Murphy knew that, had known it even while he was doing it. Normal would have been taking cover when the first machine gun burst sparked off the vehicle's armor. Normal would have been falling back when the assault gun appeared. Normal would have been following the tactical doctrine that said unsupported infantry didn't engage armor in open terrain. But Rodriguez had been bleeding in the snow, and Baker and Chen were 19 years old and a long way from home. Normal was a luxury that young men couldn't always afford when other lives hung in the balance. So Murphy had climbed onto a burning vehicle and fired a machine gun until it ran dry, because someone had to and there was nobody else to do it. The reinforcements arrived 20 minutes later, a full platoon of 3rd Infantry Division soldiers who spread out across the ridge and began establishing proper defensive positions. They brought ammunition and medical supplies, hot coffee and cigarettes, and the kind of professional competence that suggested this ground would stay in American hands for the foreseeable future. Lieutenant Morrison arrived with the reinforcements, his face grim as he surveyed the defensive position and counted the German casualties scattered across the slope. He spent a long time looking at the tank destroyer, trying to understand how 4 men had held off a company-strength attack from a vehicle that should have provided cover for maybe 10 minutes at most. "What happened here?" Morrison asked, his question directed to Murphy, but his eyes taking in the whole tableau. The empty machine gun, the expended brass scattered around the vehicle, the blood in the snow where Rodriguez had been lying. Murphy thought about the question while medics loaded Rodriguez onto a stretcher and began the careful process of evacuating him to the aid station. How could he explain the moment when time had slowed and everything had become clear? How could he describe the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders, or the strange calm that had come over him when he'd climbed onto the burning vehicle? "We held the line," he said finally. It was an answer that satisfied military procedure without revealing the personal cost of holding it. 3 days later, Murphy sat alone beside the silent tank destroyer, watching snow slowly cover the scars that bullets and shrapnel had left in its armor. The ridge had been quiet since the German withdrawal, but he found himself returning to this spot whenever his duties permitted. Something about the place demanded attention, as if the ground itself remembered what had happened here and expected witnesses. The official paperwork was already working its way up through channels. Lieutenant Morrison had written a citation recommending Murphy for the Distinguished Service Cross, using language that turned 45 minutes of terror into heroic narrative suitable for public consumption. Disregarding his own safety, Private Murphy mounted a burning tank destroyer and single-handedly repelled an enemy attack of superior strength. Clean sentences that captured the tactical situation without touching the human reality underneath. The citation wouldn't mention how his hands had shaken while loading the machine gun, or the way Rodriguez's blood had looked against the snow, or the long moment when he'd thought about his mother's letters and wondered if he would ever see Texas again. Baker approached through the pine trees, moving with the careful quiet that infantry learned in contested territory. The replacement had aged years in the past 3 days, his face carrying lines that hadn't been there when the squad had started their morning patrol. Combat did that to young men, compressed lifetimes of experience into moments that changed everything about how they saw the world. "Chen's been asking questions," Baker said, settling himself against a fallen log where he could watch the approaches to the ridge. "Wants to know why you stayed up there so long. Keep saying it doesn't make tactical sense." Murphy understood Chen's confusion. By doctrine, his position on the tank destroyer should have been untenable the moment the Germans brought up their assault gun. A reasonable person would have taken cover and called for artillery support, or withdrawn to a secondary position where the squad could continue resistance with better odds of survival. But doctrine hadn't accounted for Rodriguez bleeding in the snow, or the way the ridge commanded approaches that other American units would have to defend if this position fell. Doctrine was written by people who understood tactics but might never have faced the moment when abstract principles collided with the faces of men who trusted you to get them home. Some things don't make tactical sense, Murphy said. Doesn't mean they're wrong. Word had come down from division headquarters that morning. The German counterattack in the Colmar pocket had been larger than anyone initially realized. A coordinated effort involving multiple battalions and designed to disrupt American preparations for the final offensive into Germany. The ridge that Murphy's squad had held was a key observation point that could have compromised the entire 3rd Infantry Division advance. Higher command was pleased with the results. The local action had been contained, enemy casualties were significant, and American forces retained control of strategically vital terrain. Numbers on a situation map that validated the tactical wisdom of holding positions at all costs, regardless of the personal cost to the men who did the holding. Rodriguez was recovering at a field hospital 15 miles behind the lines. The medics said he'd keep his leg, though he'd probably walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Better than the alternatives that had seemed likely when he was bleeding against the tank destroyer's tracks. The kid had asked to be returned to the squad as soon as the doctors would clear him for duty. That was the part that kept Murphy awake at night, not the memory of machine gun fire or the sound of bullets sparking off armor, but the knowledge that men like Rodriguez would follow him into situations that might kill them because they trusted his judgment. It was a weight that medals couldn't balance and citations couldn't explain. Chen appeared at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held ready, but his movements relaxed enough to suggest the area was secure. The replacement had been different since the action on the ridge, quieter, more thoughtful, as if he'd glimpsed something about warfare that the training manuals hadn't prepared him for. "Lieutenant wants to see you," Chen reported. "Something about paperwork from regiment." Murphy nodded, knowing what the paperwork would contain. More questions about the action, requests for detailed reports that would be typed up and filed in folders that historians might read decades later. The slow process by which lived experience was transformed into official history, filtered through language that emphasized heroism while filtering out the human cost of heroic actions. He stood and took a last look at the tank destroyer, its hull now dusted with fresh snow that would eventually cover all evidence of what had happened here. In years to come, this would be just another ridge in the Vosges Mountains, notable only to military historians who studied the final campaigns of World War II in Europe. But Murphy would remember the weight of the machine gun in his hands, the way time had slowed when everything depended on decisions made without time to think. He would remember Rodriguez's trust and Baker's fear and Chen's questions about tactical sense. Most of all, he would remember the moment when courage and terror had balanced each other perfectly, and he had chosen to stay because leaving would have cost too much. The wind picked up, whistling through the destroyed vehicle's twisted metal and carrying the sound across valleys where other battles waited to be fought. In the distance, American voices called to each other as patrols moved through the forest, continuing the slow work of pushing the war toward its inevitable conclusion. Young men following orders and protecting each other, writing their own chapters in a story that was bigger than any individual could comprehend. Murphy shouldered his rifle and walked toward the American lines, leaving the ridge to its silence and its memories. Behind him, snow continued to fall, slowly erasing the visible evidence of courage while preserving its invisible weight in the lives of men who would carry it forward long after the shooting stopped. If this story reminded you that behind every medal, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.